Being the only child in my family, I spent a lot of time by myself outside. A lot more time playing outside than most of my friends, as a matter of fact. While many of them would be involved in their Xboxes and PlayStations, I was always trying to get the better out of what nature had to offer me as a child. Our home was sitting on the outskirts of town, and it backed up to a very, very large wooded area. My parents were pretty strict about me being outside. I had to be within sight at all times, or they would come looking for me. However, I still went out and about and explored on my own. They said they would have to come looking for me, but they hardly if ever did. I think those rules were bent quite a bit. I spent hours every day exploring inside this wooded area, hence why I say my parents' rules were pretty well bent. It was like my own little world I could get lost in. On this particular story, it was early in the fall, but it felt like late summer. You know, when it's not too hot, but it's not too cold. Probably about 70 degrees and sunny. There were leaves starting to fall, but it hadn't got yet that crisp air that fall brings. It was maybe around 6 or 7 p.m. I can't remember exactly, but the sun was just beginning to set. I had heard my parents calling for me from inside the house. I knew it was dinner time. So I was maybe no more than 100 or 200 feet tucked into the woods. I began to walk back out the forest, picking up speed as my stomach began to grumble. But as I got closer to the fence line into our backyard, I stopped at the edge of this clearing, just in front of our back patio or yard area, when I could see something strange in the neighbor's yard. This made me stop dead in my tracks. Whatever it was, an animal, I assume, was standing next to their shed behind their home, kind of crouched over. It looked like a large ape, but with a dog head. I came to that conclusion because of the ears and the shape of the head. Then, in that same moment, I heard something large from behind me approaching. As I turned around, this creature, or animal, was also dog-like in appearance, but unlike the other thing that I saw, had no fur at all. Its entire body was bare, and it appeared to be covered in this gross, mangy-looking skin. The whole thing just looked wrong. I could feel my stomach drop, and this rush of adrenaline hit me as I heard the animal behind me start growling. I realized it was already too late to run past this creature in front of me, so I crouched down into a tense position, ready for whatever may come next. This thing looked different than the other creature over by the shed. They did look similar, but this thing looked at me like it was pleased that I was going to be its next meal. I'm still shocked at how quietly it snuck up on me. My mother called out again for me, and as soon as the creature heard her voice, it stopped like it was surprised, looking in the direction of her voice. It then turned around and began jumping over logs, running through trees at a speed I couldn't understand, until it vanished into the forest on the far side of our neighbor's yard. I heard whatever was the same strange creature by the shed in my neighbor's yard follow after it. I was so terrified. I remember I peed my pants. Of course, after going in, my mother just kept laughing at me. Couldn't understand for the faintest reason why I had peed myself and why I was so scared. I played it off, of course, and never told her. I knew she would never believe me. This encounter has been so terrifying. I have never really explored in the forest around my neighborhood, not since that day. I have never told or said anything to my neighbor after that either. Come to think of it, after this, I don't recall seeing these strange animals again. I'm posting this here because it seems appropriate and a good spot to share my weird experiences that I had to endure when I was younger. Everybody who reads this, please stay safe. It was about 11 p.m., and I was walking home from work. It had gotten dark outside by this time, but there was a full moon that night. It illuminated the surrounding area pretty well. I was walking down the side of the road, as there is no sidewalk, when I heard what sounded like loud growling from behind. I turned around to see what in fact was this thing, running at me, with its head very low to the ground, but coming in my direction. It looked very tall and skinny from a distance, but its size must have been close to that of an average adult, if not larger. It had very large arms, muscular, even though the torso was very slender. The closer this thing got, the louder it began breathing. It kind of had this rhythmic tone to it. It stopped, staring at me for several seconds, before quickly walking off. I could hear it moving through the woods in my direction, right next to me, and I realized it had walked into the forest next to me, to stay concealed, following me, paralleling me in the woods. It was now approaching me, almost at a 90-degree angle from the trees, so it could stay hidden. I began panicking, not sure what my next move should or could be, or what exactly I was dealing with. I was convinced that in this moment, this was a demon. I remained frozen where I stood, hearing it come closer and closer in the darkening woods. Once it got about 20 or so feet from me, I knew I had no choice but to flee, or I'd be a goner. I didn't think I could outrun it, so I quickly turned to my right, booked it back the way I came, towards my house. I ran as hard as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often, while expecting this thing to be not far behind. It felt like an eternity until I passed the tree line for the side of the road and entered into a more open area again, where there were houses with people living in them. They were still at least a quarter mile before I was finally able to reach my street. That's when all the sounds stopped behind me, and I began hearing a strange mechanical whirring noise, coming from somewhere nearby, but could not see where it was coming from. The sound grew louder, moving closer by, and this loud mechanical humming noise that just seemed to come from everywhere. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I continued to push hard and run. That's when, with the full moon now behind me, I suddenly saw something moving beside my house, about 50 or so feet in front of me. It was a tall black silhouette that stood out against all the light around it. It was this translucent figure. It looked like something from another world. I knew at this point, whatever this thing was, it seemed to be targeting me, specifically in watching its movement as best I could, while darting between two houses nearby, where there were jagged piles of rock blocking my path. The kind of rocks that people put in front or the side of their house for decoration. It's hard to explain. I quickly made it back into my house, locking everything. My parents were crashed out, so they didn't hear or see anything. Of course, the rest of that night was very stressful. I would see these strange, mysterious lights shining into my window. Even though I'm on the second story, I would hear strange growling outside my house, and these bizarre sounds, mechanical noises, humming, heavy footsteps, thumping, pounding, and other bizarre strange noises I can't exactly explain. I don't know if I had an alien encounter or what on earth I experienced this night. It is hands down the most frightening thing I have ever gone through to date. It was 7 p.m., and a family was driving down a lonely road in the middle of Maine. It was a Friday night, and it looked like they were going to have the house all to themselves for the rest of the weekend. But what happened 1 hour later, as they drove home, changed their lives forever. They saw something crossing the street ahead of them. At first, they thought that it might be an injured dog or cat, and stopped to see if it was okay. But as they got closer, it became pretty apparent. This animal-looking creature actually, to their horror, had human-like features, but with this thick, dense fur covering it. This made them scared, so they decided to step on the gas and get away from there as fast as possible. One day after this incident, people began reporting the same creature but in other areas. Some people claimed that it was a werewolf, while others just said that it was a bear who walked upright. There have also been several reports of this creature, but no one has managed to get any clear pictures or even videos of what is truly going on. All we know is that this thing is very large. It has also been seen in many different locations. We just ask anyone who's seen it. For example, this Dogman creature was also seen in Michigan back in 1987 by two campers. They saw something chasing a deer, which they then witnessed this big tall monster on its hind legs. They said it looked just like a wolf, an upright walking wolf. It had a strong canine head, black fur, and very overly sized arms, more resembling that of a man than a dog. Since then, I've heard of reports of people seeing this creature more often in different parts of the world. Canada, for example. 3 people I know personally saw these creatures walking on their hind legs. I also have connections in Virginia, where people have reported seeing this werewolf-like being heavily around 2002 to 2005. Apparently, it tried to attack people living nearby, but always ran off when somebody spotted him or her. This creature can be around 7 feet tall and has been known to be very violent. It also kills animals like horses and cattle, so if you see it, call for help and stay away from these creatures. They can be incredibly dangerous. I had a pretty horrific encounter back in 2014 during the late fall. I don't believe in werewolves or things like that, but I had a strange encounter with this being that closely resembled one. It looked like it came from Hollywood. Anyhow, here's my encounter. I was walking down my street. It was about 6 a.m., and since I didn't have a car, I was on my way to work. I remember it was raining lightly, and because of the time of year, it was still pretty dark. I had my hood over my head, and this large shape caught the corner of my eye. As I turned to look up, there was this large figure, and it didn't really make much sense. It looked like a man covered in long hair, hung down all over his body, standing, looking at one of the upper branches in an oak tree. The smell hit my nose as soon as I saw it. It was like old eggs and rotting meat. Strange but very specific smelling. It stuck out to me at first because of this thing. It just looked so out of place. But due to the haze of the rain and how dark it was, I couldn't really register what exactly it was. Then, it stops and looks over at me, and I stopped, dead in my tracks, because all I could see is this silhouette and these 2 glowing orbs of light. What's crazy is that moment we made eye contact. This just feeling, this jolt of fear shot through my body. Now, it's not a normal fear like what you feel when you see something go wrong. But I knew that this was an immense danger, and whatever this was could destroy me without even trying. Or so that's the emotion it relayed. Its eyes were so bright, glowing, the same way a deer's does when it's hit with headlights. But except it was that way all the time. I can think about as I looked at this thing, how much it reminded me of something straight out of a movie. It just stood there for a moment, staring at me, staying still. It didn't make an expression, at least not that I could see. And then, after some time, it slowly turned, walking into this very small alleyway. And I realized it was out in the open and was trying to hide itself. Now, I was out in the open. There could be more of these things. But I was firmly planted in this one spot, frozen, unable to move. There's this thing that happens to your mind when you endure something like this. There's no words to really explain it, except true fear. A kind of primal fear your body only experiences once. There's a few shortcomings to what I can accurately explain. When you're in a situation like that, your mind isn't thinking about how you should be reacting. And furthermore, it's not the kind of thing you could just be brushed off and forgotten. I remember my legs feeling weak, my body entirely numb at first, before this strange rush of energy hit me, and I'd been ejected out of a slingshot. The second it happened, I took off. I ran home as fast as possible without looking back once, until after I got inside, which is when reality really began to set in on what had actually occurred only moments before. It's one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me, but for some reason, this is the most vivid memory I actually have. Now, I was so terrified, I had to call my boss and tell him he had to come pick me up. He was pissed, but he understood. I just told him there was an emergency and lied. I've never had any other encounters with anything else, like this one, but sometimes I think back to that evening, or morning, and wonder what exactly it was. I'm not sure how anybody could attribute what I saw to anything other than a werewolf, or maybe a mythical but real creature. I understand. It all sounds crazy when you say it out loud, and definitely doesn't fit the typical description of something so simple, like a dog. To this day, I've never heard somebody tell me about seeing something similar, until recently, when I had several friends on social media start posting their own stories and experiences with this strange canine creature in their hometown. It got me thinking again about my experiences from long ago. These are friends who don't believe in the paranormal, friends who don't acknowledge what a cryptid is. Although, I don't even know what it is that I experienced. I'm not trying to sound like some kind of kook or anything, but those eyes, that hair, and that smell, it's gonna stick with me. I just hope this isn't a sign of things to come, and maybe it's just a fluke, or something entirely separate from everything else going on in the world right now. But for some reason, I have this terrible feeling I won't be the last time I see it. My boyfriend and I were driving on a back road in northern Maine. We saw something terrible. We were traveling along a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by trees as far as the eye could see, white snow on the ground. On our right was a ravine. On our left is where we saw it. It was hairy, had short ears, and walked like a man, but stood kind of like an ape, hunched over. Had a very strange gait, too. It also had a canine head. I thought it was a bear at first, or maybe a deer. After all, we were deep in the woods, so seeing a bear or deer isn't that unusual, right? Well, my boyfriend starts driving faster after he looked at what he pulled its head out from drinking the water in the streams. And he said to me, "Did you see that thing?" I only got to catch a glimpse, but I can tell you that this wasn't a bear or a deer. My boyfriend isn't a very experienced hunter, so he can definitely debunk a misidentification. This wasn't it. We were both so scared, we didn't talk about it until a day later. I have no idea what this creature was. I don't care what people say. I know what we saw, and we both have each other to verify the sighting. It has to be investigated further. Like I said, this wasn't a bear or a coyote, or a deer. I have never known of a species of canine that stands upright. If you do, please let me know. But to my knowledge, a species like that doesn't exist, period, let alone in the state of Maine. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was walking back from my boyfriend's house about 12 in the morning. We weren't even together yet, at least publicly. I knew his parents didn't care. At the time, he lived about 15 minutes away from me. It wasn't a very high-traffic neighborhood where he lived. That made me feel safer. Safer than usual, I should say, to be outside alone at such a very early hour. I hadn't gone very far when I noticed that there was movement behind me. I didn't pay much attention to it, as there are dogs and animals out at night. At least a lot of strays, I should say. I've seen at least 4 or 5 of them. So thinking it was a stray dog and it being a little dark, I couldn't get the best view. But as the noise grew right behind me, I turned, and the first thing that struck my mind, as crazy as this sounds, was a werewolf, because of the way it looked. But it was running on all 4s. And this thing runs over in my direction, but turns almost at a 100-degree angle, and kind of cuts me off. This more than scared me, more than I could really handle. So I fled, and I got all the way back home, and I told my now boyfriend that I don't know if it was going to work, at least leaving so early in the morning. He vouched to walk home with me at night, told me that he'd tell his parents that he was going to walk his friend home. And while that made me feel safer, I can't help but digest the fact that I saw a flipping werewolf. I told him that, and he tried to calm me down and just explain that it was probably just a large dog, and the shadows played a trick on me. Even as the weeks went on, he still gave me crap for it, mentioning, "Do you really stand by the fact that you believe you saw a werewolf?" And I would always tell him yes, that's exactly what this looked like. He grew more and more concerned as time went on because he would tell me he'd hear strange noises in his neighborhood at night, and a lot of the stray dogs would soon go missing in the coming weeks. Now, just as kind of a retrospective look on the story, I have no idea if there's any correlation to the dogs and animals going missing and what I saw that night and the noises he had been hearing. But either way, it was enough to kind of scare him, because I think he started believing me. Especially at first, he started off making fun of me. Well, his tune changed up quite a bit. Then fast forward another month, and all the cats and dogs in the neighborhood were virtually gone. Something else to note is that this neighborhood isn't some out in the middle of nowhere place. It's just a little suburban neighborhood, nowhere near any woods or anything. In fact, there's a pretty busy intersection about a quarter-mile away, and a major highway in the other direction. So, again, I have no idea what any of all this means. And unless werewolves are real, or there is such thing as giant wolves that look freaky, then maybe that's what him and I saw. Let me start this off by saying that I never thought in my life I'd experience something like this. It's certainly been pretty interesting. I was having a friend stay the weekend. We were out walking about, 1 a.m. This was in late July. We were just taking in the wonderful summer night air, enjoying each other's company. It was particularly warm out, considering it was late July. You know how it can be during the early morning hours. Still pretty residually hot. There wasn't really anybody else around, seeing we were on the far end of a park by ourselves. Off in the distance, past some trees, I could see a light though. It kind of looked like it might be coming from a house, but there was no noise. And suddenly, what appeared to be this large black dog jumps out from behind this tree, running full speeds toward us. We both were startled, leaping back and running. It got pretty close to us and started growling, but then stopped dead in its tracks, about 15 feet from us. This wolf or dog was incredibly massive. If I've ever used the term dire wolf, this would have been it. Easily the size of a lion, larger than a Great Dane, the biggest dog I'd ever seen. I remember this. It matched up perfectly with the darkness surrounding it. We both ran. We weren't going to take our chances with whatever this hellhound was. Anyway, when we got back to our house, we kept turning around to make sure it never followed us, and it never did. We got back and my friend's dad was really drunk. got mad at us for being noisy coming in the house. We tried to explain that there was a person chasing us, but he just told us to stop smoking weed and go to bed. Of course, we didn't smoke weed at all. This was something I can't get out of my mind. Was this a hellhound, or was this something else? I am a paranormal investigator, and I've gotten some reports of some recent sightings happening in Michigan. The witness I was speaking to was walking home from work late one evening. He claims he heard a rustling sound coming up from behind him. He turned to see what the source of the noise was and saw something that terrified him. He claims he saw this thing moving towards him on two legs, running like a man, but it wasn't. He knows what he saw. It didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. He described seeing an upright like canine figure, covered in black fur, except for its face, which had human-like features, such as eyes and large teeth, but also had sharp claws on its hands, and these massive fangs. He claimed to be so terrified by the sight that he dropped his cell phone, running home as fast as he could. He didn't go out at night anymore, unless he had a friend with him. Now, over the past few years, sightings of black creatures resembling wolfmen have become increasingly common. These rumors lead to an online community dedicated to proving that Dogman is real. This group collected data on reported Dogman sightings in order to try and prove there were more than just anecdotal evidence of these beings' existence. They pointed towards the fact that there were well over 100 reports within the last 7 years alone. That's a rate of about 2 or 3 every month. In addition, most witnesses claim that they've seen a Dogman in areas where there have been reports of other known Dogman sightings. They have also pointed to closer instances, like one that happened to Gabe in 2016, and even closer than was a Dogman attack that happened just last year. In the case, there were 2 victims claiming they were attacked by a human creature. They say human because of how closely it resembled a man. It had long claws and actually tore its way into the house. It's reported that this thing ended up chasing the family out of the house before they ran by to a neighbor's house for safety. And although they aren't exactly sure what attacked them, both family individuals swear that it bore features resembling those of a human, while also possessing canine qualities. Since my daughter is a junior in high school, she often has late-night practices with her theater group. On performance nights, sometimes she wouldn't finish until close to midnight, especially when it is a winter show. I always insist on driving her home. This night, it was around 11:30 p.m. It was stormy, and it was December. There were only a few days left until the holiday break, and of course, like any good holiday, we were due for snow. But for now, it was just wet, cold, and windy. I was worried about power lines or trees coming down, but the only way back home from the school involved going past some woods. I made sure I used my husband's truck, took it slow down windy roads. My kid was still high on adrenaline from the show, chattering non-stop in a way that teen girls seem to have perfected, when suddenly, I saw something run out in front of us. I slammed on the brakes. We skidded to a complete stop right in front of this thing, which had raced out of the trees on one side of the road, but decided it would stay right smack bang in the middle and risk me flattening it. My daughter did scream, but we did not hit it. Must have missed it by a whisker. Whatever it was had bounded out of the trees on 4 legs, as you would expect from any type of creature. It was big. In the blind panic of braking, I hadn't really paused to consider exactly what it could be. The most plausible guess, of course, was a deer. Now, in the dim beam of the headlights, I really couldn't tell for certain. but the only thing that made a lick of sense was that it was a really abnormally large wolf. We do have them in these parts, although it is highly unusual to ever see one. They are usually found much closer to the mountains. I was still catching my breath, just thanking God that I hadn't hit the thing. As much for our own sake as the animals, it would have likely totaled the truck. When my daughter said, "Mom, what was that thing?" I was about to reply that it was just a wolf, and although they could be dangerous, we were safe in the vehicle, no doubt. It would just run off any second. That's when I saw movement out of the windshield, right there in front of both of us. The wolf stood up on two legs, like a person. We sat there just gawping at this thing. I could see that it was quite comfortable on two legs. Not like when your pet dog is begging for a treat for a second or two. This creature's body looked right, stood up, and that was when it dawned on me that despite being hairy, the body and limbs were very much like a human. But that head, there was nothing human about that. Now that it was facing us, we had a much better view. I could see it wasn't a wolf at all, but a dog actually. More like a German shepherd. Piercing amber eyes. And it made this horrible noise. I guess it was a howl, but it sounded like a child's scream. High-pitched. And then, as quick as it had originally raced out of the tree line, it sped off again through the woods on the opposite side of the road. We sat there for about another minute, catching our breath, and then I continued to drive carefully home. Being a teen, as soon as we got home, my daughter began Googling, asking people on her social media accounts, and before long, she was convinced she had seen a Dogman. Having read through some of the descriptions other people have given, I had to agree. Knowing that so many other people out there had witnessed one of these creatures was both comforting as to solidify the fact that I'm not going mad, but it also fills me with dread. We have no choice but to travel through those woods, and sometimes late at night. But when possible, I get my husband to do it, or I ask my daughter to stay with a friend. I really don't want to ever see that thing again, or anything like it. I'm a trucker, and often make long trips across the country, sometimes lasting weeks. I always sleep in the rig, and have been doing this for several years now. Whilst it isn't exactly a 5-star accommodation, I'll never get used to relying on gas station restrooms to keep clean. It is a job, and it helps pay for my family. It can get pretty lonely on these longer trips, but these days, I got the advantage of podcasts and audiobooks. Usually, I drive until I just can't anymore, then find a truck stop. Sometimes, though, it has just been on the side of the road, as long as it is safe, of course. It was one of those times when this incident occurred. I'd been on the road for hours, trying to find somewhere decent to pull over and stop for the night, but there was nothing for miles around. Just trees and timber as far as the eye could see. This was in the Pacific Northwest, although I forget where. I do remember there being a huge Christmas farm nearby. You'd have seen the plenty of amenities too, but it seemed like this particular stretch of road I was on was strictly the basics. Eventually, I found a rather safe spot when the road had widened. I could park up safely with the knowledge that, in a highly unlikely chance, somebody else needed to pass by me, they could do so safely, securely, without crashing into me. I shut my eyes, and I remember being out. Maybe around 2 a.m., very still outside. I was pretty pissed when I woke up suddenly. Having been doing this for years, I've gotten used to sleeping through all sorts, and it usually takes a lot of commotion to wake me after I've fallen into an exhausted slumber. I'm a heavy sleeper, what can I say? So, what could possibly be making all that noise in this completely empty stretch of road. It sounded like a screaming, maybe like a kid. But I have plenty of hunting buddies who would tell you that there are several animals out there who can mimic noises, akin to a woman being murdered. I don't know much about that, but I guess there's such things as mountain lions that can do that. Therefore, I wasn't worried that I was witnessing some middle-of-nowhere serial killer. But I did want whatever the hell was out there to be quiet. I needed to go back to sleep. I was staring out of the window, thinking I can give a nice long blast on the air horn and maybe scare whatever it was out there making a racket, when I saw movement from outside the vehicle. Whatever the creature was, it had come out of the trees and seemed to be standing right next to the truck. Have you ever been in a country lane in the middle of the night? No streetlights out there. It was completely dark. Yet, I instinctively knew that something was off. You see, although I could only make the outline of the animal, it was tall since I could see the head from the cab of my truck. That shouldn't have been possible. It didn't seem to be moving. Whatever it was, just stood still in front of the road. So, I carefully flicked on the engine, just enough to turn the lights on. I got a full view of just what was out there. The lights blinded it for a second, and it let out another one of those darn screams. It was even worse with it being closer, but the sound I could account for. What made no sense at all was how large this creature seemed to be. As I said, it was tall, around 6.5 to 7 feet, at a guess. A very stocky body, kind of like that of a pro footballer. And said body was very much like a guy's, stacked, hairy, very large muscly limbs in proportion, the same as a human. But the head. I'm not very good at identifying breeds of dog, but when I got home after this, I looked up and can confirm that this thing had the head of a Doberman Pinscher. Again, totally in proportion to the size of a human-looking body, but completely and totally canine. It also appeared to be grinning at me. At least, that was what it looked like. If you can try at all to imagine a dog's face manipulated into a very human-looking expression, if it hadn't already been something that had messed with my mind, I'd never forget. That eerie and out-of-place grin cemented it. I honked on the horn as hard as I could, giving it a good blast. There was chaos around for a minute or two, birds taking off out of the trees. I heard various other critters sounding their displeasure. A deer made it to cross the road, took one look at the creature still in front of me, and did a sort of backwards leap, back into the trees from where it came. With that, the Dogman gave another high-pitched howl, and then leapt after the deer. That leap in and of itself should not have been possible. It would have been Olympic-worthy. I didn't even look at the clock, just slammed my foot on the gas, and was out of there as fast as I could get my rig to move. I drove for about another hour until I found a gas station. This is where I pulled in and slept fitfully for the rest of the night. No one that I told afterwards believed me, of course. They all asked what I'd been listening to. Lord of the Rings, actually, since the books are so long, and the audio even longer. It keeps me entertained for hours, which is of course fantasy, but I'm pretty sure Tolkien didn't include things like werewolves or man-dogs in any of his work. They also said that I had been dreaming, or was just so tired, I hallucinated the entire thing. My only counterpoint for that would be that until that night, and even after I had gotten home and did research, I'd never even heard of the concept of a Dogman. If I'd ever supposed such a thing existed, not being that familiar with dog breeds, how could I have imagined that exact type of dog that these are made of? I could have just conjured up something like Lassie or Scooby-Doo. I know I did not imagine that thing. It was as real as you or me. And yes, it was nasty.